As Tim mentioned, I'm the publisher of Lion's Roar and Buddha Dharma. We're celebrating our 40th year of publishing this year, and part of what we're doing to celebrate is this partnership with the Rubin. We, as we started looking at what it meant for us to turn 40, or for some of us to turn a little bit older, but for the magazine to turn 40, we really wanted to be looking forward, not doing a retrospective. And I think that what felt important to us, coming as we do from a Buddhist perspective, I suppose I should have said that from the outset, for those who aren't familiar, our magazines are Buddhist magazines. We wanted to look at what the future holds for Buddhism and what Buddhism might be able to offer into the world as we look to the future. And so I think this particular topic is one that is very important to me. I think that for those who are Buddhists or know about Buddhism, there's definitely a thread that runs through the Buddhist world about Buddhism being a path of primarily focused on personal liberation. And I think that that has changed significantly over the past decades, but it's still there, and I still encounter it myself. And so the world needs a lot of help. There's a tremendous amount of suffering and pain in the world. That's what samsara is. But I think the idea that we ought not actively engage in the world and actively seek ways to aid some of that suffering feels, to me at least, like something from a little bit from another time, or maybe it's missing the whole picture. So we're thrilled to be able to be here at the Rubin tonight with three excellent panelists to help us explore this, not just from a Buddhist perspective, but also from a perspective that's equally important to us at Lion's Roar, which is how Buddhism can be relevant to the culture more broadly, and what Buddhists can learn from others in the culture who don't identify themselves as Buddhists. So I'd like to introduce our panelists, each of whom I think brings something very special and also very different to the stage. First, on your left, we have Lydia Mason, who is a current student, political science student at NYU. Lydia, in spite of being, I think it's okay to say, relatively young, has an impressive record already as an activist. And I think that we were just talking before we came in here about her intentions to remain very much an activist, and to pursue an aspiration of someday being an academic in that, in worlds related to that. Lydia is also a poet, and I would encourage everybody here when you go home to look up a poem of hers that you can watch her performing on YouTube called Dear America. It's powerful and touching, and I think that everybody here would find it enlightening in some way. So thank you for being here, Lydia. Next to Lydia, we have Serene Jones, who is the first woman president of the Union Theological Seminary. And she's also the author of several books, most recently Call It Grace, which is Finding Meaning in a Fractured World, which is a personal memoir. Is that right, Serene? Yeah. And finally, Sharon Salzberg, who is a Buddhist teacher in the Insight world, co-founder of the Insight Meditation Society and the author of many books, most recently the New York Times bestseller, Real Love. But she was just telling me before we began here that she's currently working on a book coincidentally titled Real Change. And so maybe in some of her comments tonight we'll get a little bit of a preview of that. So I think that's all that I have to say. Thanks again for coming. And I'd like to pass it to you, Lydia, to introduce yourself and then along the line. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'd just like to start by saying thank you again to Lion's Roar and to the Rubin Museum for having me and the rest of the panel. So just kind of a background of who I am. Again, I'm a student at NYU majoring in politics. My dream would be to continue to be an activist as well as an academic. But my background into how I got into spirituality and the intersection of spirituality and activism is kind of just a story of how I came to discover myself. As he said, I am pretty young, so it kind of just started when I was growing up as a child in Kentucky. So I was raised in the Bible Belt, or the Deep South. So both of my parents are devout Baptists. I grew up going to church not just on Sundays, but Saturdays and Wednesdays. My mom worked in the church part-time, so I was raised very religious. Up until 6th grade, I was attending a private Christian school, and that kind of shaped how I viewed religion. It was a very big part of my life. But when I turned about 12 or 13, I started to question things, not because I was thinking about whether or not God was real or Christianity was true, but because of the things that I was learning in school and how they conflicted with my identity. So the school that I went to was predominantly white, but it was also predominantly conservative. And me being a queer Black woman, coming to realize that I was a queer Black woman, I realized that my identity wasn't necessarily congruent with the things that I was being taught. And so it kind of forced me to reconcile what it was that I thought that I believed and question whether or not that was something that I wanted to believe in because of who I was. So as I got older, around 14 or 15, I started to realize that maybe religion, or the religion that I grew up with and came to understand as Christianity, wasn't what I really needed. So when I was 15 years old, I came out to my parents. That was a very difficult thing. They weren't the most understanding. It wasn't the worst experience ever, but there was a lot of pushback. And that's when I started to get involved in activism, especially gender activism. I started to identify as a feminist, also started working with Black Lives Matter. Those things kind of gave me an outlet to express what I identified as my morality and my beliefs. So for me, spirituality is not something that necessarily has to come from religion or Christianity or Buddhism or anything like that. For me, I create my own spirituality and my own morality from what it is that I believe and the experiences that I've had.
Wow. So my story is actually so different, and this makes it so interesting to have these conversations. So I grew up in Oklahoma, in a tiny little town, and I grew up to a very progressive Christian family. Both of my parents were active in the civil rights movement. I grew up going to protest marches, and because I came out of progressive Christianity, there was never in my family a distinction made between activism and your faith. This is what it meant. You know, you read the Bible and Jesus went to the margins of society and gave voice to the voiceless and freed the captives and proclaimed liberation to the oppressed. And so that was what we were supposed to do. And as I grew up over time, I came to realize that a lot of some of the activism of my younger years, like when I was 6, 7, 8, I have vivid memories of protests at that point when we were living in Dallas. But as I've grown older, I've come to question a lot of the ease with which my white liberal family was able to assume that because we thought that we were so progressive and we were going to protest, that actually meant that we had done the kind of work that we needed to do to really dig into ourselves as a family and as white privileged people in the United States. Now I'm president of Union, which, if you don't know about Union Theological Seminary, it's 200 years old almost. It was formed by a bunch of renegade pastors who thought you couldn't learn anything about God if you were doing it in the countryside in the quiet. You had to go to the city and do it on the docks, where all the world was, the chaos of the world was. And it's been doing that ever since. And we are so far left that sometimes we almost fall off the map of left and right. We're way over here. And most recently, we were the birthplace of what's called Black Liberation Theology, which was the movement that said God is black. And what does that mean when you say something like that? And queer theology, feminist theology, these movements within mainline Christianity had their birthplace at my school. And now, in the past 10 years, we've become increasingly interreligious. So we have a program in Buddhism and a program in Islam, and we're across the street from Jewish Theological Seminary, so we have a program in Judaism, and that has been just enormously expanding for me. Now we have students. If you're a student at Union, you can assume that you're sitting in a class with some people who are going to go into Christian ministry, a large group of people who don't affiliate with any religion, and some who are very clearly Buddhist, some who are Hindu and not quite sure what that means, and Muslim students. And that's like an enormously transformative experience with respect to activism. And the last thing I'll say is that oftentimes when people think about interreligious conversations, they think about people from different religious traditions or people of conscious and no tradition coming together and starting at the top and saying what they believe about God or what they don't believe about God. And at Union, we start on the ground and we say, what is the social injustice that needs to be addressed, and what is the vision of justice that we hold, and how can we work on that together, and then move up from there. Our activism actually is the thing that binds us together, and that gives a whole different cast to how you think about what your faith is.
Hey, so I'm from New York City, and I went to college in Buffalo, New York in 1968, so that symbolizes a lot right there. Serene asked me if we closed the school down, and I said many times.
Good.
I think one of the clear formative experiences for me was witnessing, even from afar, the Vietnam War. Both because there was a draft and people I knew were going to fight, and because it was on TV. I think that was actually the first time I ever saw a Buddhist on TV. And because the sense of alienation and seeking power and seeking clarity was very strong. And so our campus was often shut down, and there were a lot of protests, and there wasn't yet this kind of division between kind of spirituality or inner seeking for truth and political action. And the other great formative experience, which I also was just a witness to, was the civil rights movement, which, as far as I could tell, was all about love from beginning to end. It was that power. And even now, if I watch a documentary about, say, freedom riders going out and registering people to vote, which is one of my great passions, is voting, which I'll get to in a second, and being beaten and being in the hospital and praying before they went out there and in the hospital saying, you know, we're practicing nonviolence. And it was such a sense of wholeness, of completeness, and even joy, you know. And so that was all sort of milling about in me. I went to India in my junior year and began studying meditation. Of course, became a meditation teacher, and that has been the real mode of expression or service in my life. And yet there's always been this other thread, which is not so widely known. A lot of it these days has come out in advocating for things like voting, which is actually very interesting for me. You know, every time I never really tell people who to vote for, although it would be nice, but I don't feel I can do that yet. It's the act of engagement, which in my mind is so synchronous with so much of the Buddhist teaching about innate human dignity, and everybody has the right to have a voice, and we live in a world of interconnection, and how do you manifest that except through really using that voice? And nobody has the right to take that away from you because of that innate human dignity, and so on. So, but every time I write something about it, well, the first time in recent times I wrote something about it, my assistant came to me and she said, "You just lost a lot of followers." And I thought, oh, that's interesting.
Voting?
Yeah, about voting. And then when I would write again, and people, like I wrote something for On Being, and I read the comments, which is always an interesting thing to do. And, you know, people wrote things like, I can't believe you're encouraging people to join this evil system, or one person said this violent system. And I thought, okay, you know, this is very intense, actually, to go into these waters and to, you know, to take a stand. And yet, you know, how else do you express your values except in terms of this is how you think about living it? And so I find it's just a very interesting time.
Yes.
In those ways.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like, and maybe I'd love to hear all of us talk about it, but I feel like sometimes I feel very lucky, and sometimes I feel like, oh my God, how did this happen? But that we're in the midst, when you think about the big changes that happen in history, we are in the midst of an enormous, I call it spiritual, but an enormous spiritual upheaval and sort of groans and the struggles of a radically different kind of story about human beings and our purpose and where we're going is struggling to come out. And as a scholar, I study the Reformation 500 years ago, and I know when that happened in Europe 500 years ago, it changed Europe dramatically. It changed every social system, but it was also very bloody and violent. And so it's like, it's both with a sense of expectation that I think about activism and spirit right now and the possibilities it has for getting at the root of some of the most horrendous parts of humanity. And yet those same horrendous parts they feel like they're coming up and grabbing hold of us right now, and they're not going to let us go until we actually figure out how to fight them off. And so it's a very deep and important historical moment that we're in. I don't know if as a college student, do you feel that? Like, it almost feels apocalyptic to me in terms of the forces at work.
Yeah, I mean, as someone as young as I am, I feel like it's a little bit different because I feel like I was almost born into the change. Like, I feel like I was born into a time when I think things were constantly changing and shifting in the world. But I definitely agree, just like from my early memories, just seeing the contrast between like, I guess like 2005 to now, I feel like things are changing so much. And I think that has to do with like what you were talking about, Sharon, like with the Vietnam War. You said that was the first time you ever saw a Buddhist. I feel like the increase in representation of different kinds of voices, different kinds of spirituality, and ideas of what is moral and what is our understanding of religion, I think is helping to kind of create that shift. But I think it's a good kind of change in that sense. For example, the church that my parents go to, I believe last year for the first time, they allowed a woman to baptize someone. For like up until then, only men were allowed to. And then also just like the conversation, at least I'm only really familiar with Christianity, but just the level of acceptance for people within the LGBT community, or the idea of what is the role of the man and the woman within the house. Those things, just in my life, I've seen the shift in terms of what they've considered to be acceptable. Like, men and women can work, and women can be a little bit more, I guess, of a leader within their household. The man doesn't have to be the head of the household, and being gay can be okay. So it's like these shifts, and it seems rapid, I feel like, to people within the community, but to me, I feel like it's really great, even though it can be a little bit scary, and it's because of that representation.
Well, it's almost like there's so many parallel realities, you know. It's like listening to you, I think, wow, you know, like, I never thought that way, you know. And you're right, I think, you know, I would really agree that it is about representation. It's about familiarity, you know, that we find ourselves in one another when we actually are in a position to listen and to feel one another rather than just have these models. Oh, well, you're that kind of person, or you're that. And, you know, recently I was in California and I was sick, and I had one of the most telling experiences about that whole period was having these home health aides who were really taking care of me, and you know, it was amazing because these are people who were not paid very well usually, and often it's from some adversarial circumstance, and then basically I was living with them, you know, and we got to be really good friends, and I admired them hugely, and I thought how I'd always been in favor of their movement in the abstract, you know, like I thought, yeah, you know, of course they should, but now that I was so dependent on them and really receiving the power of their compassion, you know, and their dedication, I thought, man, these people work hard. You know, and look at how they're treated in terms of the press or the media, or disparaged, or called the other, and it was like, that's another reality, you know, and I don't even know how to approach it sometimes. It's just like, it's so completely different. I felt really grateful for the opportunity to really meet in that kind of close way.
Yeah, and that's how I feel. Is like there's these moments where we're becoming closer and closer and more proximate to other people's realities. Like, it's interesting to have like boundaries falling at the same time boundaries are being built. Like, and walls are falling and walls are being built, and it feels like these like two centrifugal forces moving in opposite directions. Just as one example, I was interviewed by Nicholas Kristof in the New York Times on Easter morning as a Christian pastor, and he wanted to, you know, make a point of the fact I was very liberal, but the headline says, "So Reverend, you think the virgin birth is bizarre." And so it was sort of designed to ignite a response, and wasn't exactly what I had said, but it was a very politically progressive view of Christianity about women and roles, how women have been oppressed, how everybody's been oppressed by Christianity. And on the one hand, it's like this outpouring of just people feeling opened and like, wow, someone's saying, I left my church because I didn't think I could say that, and someone's saying it. It was like, whoa. And then on this side, this vitriol that in my youth I didn't hear, that we didn't have in this country at the level connected exactly to religion, that was just spewed out with no screens around it at all. And so to just sort of have both of those happening simultaneously, I think kind of describes the spiritual environment we're in and what it means to do activism. I mean, and that divide is about the activism. And you can't hide the fact that it's not just a spiritual divide, it's a political divide.
Yeah. Well, it's a scary time in so many ways. I think, you know, I don't even necessarily identify as a Buddhist, although many times, depending on the context, somebody would ask me, are you a Buddhist? I might say yes, or I might say I don't think that way. But certainly I grew up Jewish, you know, and I don't practice, I'm not like observant in any way, but when, 2 blocks away from my sublet apartment here, there are swastikas being painted on the university wall, I feel very Jewish all of a sudden, and scared in a way that I'm not accustomed to being. And that's the reality of our time as well. It's been a reality for many people for a long time, and it's just, so much more.
Really bursting through.
Like kind of coming through, and it's very intense.
Yeah.
And I think part of what's in your face is the fact that you can't separate your politics and your activism from your spiritual position, because we can see everywhere that they're always implicated in each other.
Right. Yeah.
Yes.
And I think also kind of what you were talking about, how like there are so many different kinds of ideas of what Christianity can be, and like, oh, Christianity has impressed this group or that group. But I think just seeing like your example of Christianity in comparison to other examples of Christianity that I've experienced, I think it speaks to how religion, spirituality, and also political leanings or activism can be 3 separate things. Because I feel like, for me, I consider myself to be a spiritual person in the sense that I feel like I'm a very contemplative person. I think about my morality and my place within the universe and within society a lot, and I think that can be a very spiritual thing. And I'd say that in some ways there are people that I've met who I completely disagree with in terms of religion, but we have very similar spiritual beliefs. And I think that's why spirituality and activism can go so well together, because I feel like spirituality is thinking deeply about your role within society and your role within the universe. And it doesn't necessarily have to be shaped by any certain religion. And I think that was a difficult conversation that I had to have with my parents, because they felt that spirituality and morality were things that you could only understand if you followed a specific religion, and if you define them based on what some god or what some person told you were supposed to do. But it really can be so much more complex and dynamic than that.
So it's just interesting, maybe a question is like, when you hear the word spirituality, like, what does it mean?
Well, I think...
Don't mean to put you on the spot,
no,
but that's such an interesting question. Like, when we talk about that, what does that word like mean? It's very important to me too, so I just...
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I mean, for me, I think it's almost like, I guess, what would you think about when you're kind of in a meditative state, a contemplative state? So like, who am I as a person? What am I passionate about? How do I see, what is my true self, and how do I want that to manifest within the world? And so I feel like when I am involved in activism, so like I do a lot of work with women's reproductive justice, LGBT movements, Black Lives Matter, things like that. For me, that's a spiritual experience, because I feel like it's me leaving an impact on the world that's bigger than myself. And some of the work that I've done, especially like, for example, being an escort for women who are getting abortions at clinics and things like that, I'm connecting with people in kind of a spiritual way that I can't really connect with people in any other context other than activism. So I think, some people can have a spiritual experience when they're praying or when they're in church or singing or things like that. But for me, activism is in and of itself spiritual.
I don't know.
Did I get the same question?
Yeah, yes.
Well, I think about connection, I think about love. And in fact, I always enjoy seeing Tim anyway, but there's a particular moment in time that we shared that is it's sort of indelibly imprinted on my brain. So my last book was called Real Love, and I make the distinction certainly between liking somebody and approving of them and having this sort of more kind of universal sense of acknowledgement of connection, which is love. And I talked about in the book, I wrote the book almost based on this one line in a movie, the movie being called Dan in Real Life, and the line was, love is not a feeling, it's an ability, which means it's within us as a capacity to be exercised. And something I would always say is, I really want love just to be in the conversation. Let's have that included in the conversation. So when I turned in the book, the main editorial comment was, you didn't finish the book. You have to finish it. And I said, sure, I finished it. That's why I turned it in. And they said, no, you didn't finish it. You just told the story and went off somewhere. So I could not finish the book. And I would just stare at that screen and stare at the screen and stare at the screen. And then the last presidential election happened here. And Tim and I happened to be in San Diego together at a conference 2 days later, having dinner. And all of a sudden I got it, how to end the book, which was basically, if love is an ability, maybe it's also our responsibility. And that if it's going to be in the conversation, maybe it's up to us. So as he tells the story, he said, you got this really funny look on your face and you stood up in the middle of dinner and you said, I've got to go right. And I disappeared. So I think of spirituality like that, who's willing to bring in those elements? And of course, it needs real clarity, not to be confused with giving in or just accepting someone else's position, something like that.
Yeah. I love this quote. I use it in this book I wrote recently by James Baldwin, who is always, really has his, wrestling with the legacy of chattel slavery and Jim Crow. And he says, love is the only thing that will allow us to take off the masks that we know we cannot live within, but fear we cannot live without. I don't mean a facile, soppy American sense of love, but love as a fierce force. And I love that image. I think of, when I think of spirituality, I think of love. I think of this, it's very indicative of my own past. I think of it as that love is the reason we exist. It's the deepest truth about who we are, that we are loved and that we love. And that's why this existence is. Just exploring love is a lot.
So I have a question for you too. So how do you think we can use love as this kind of radical tool? So, obviously, right now, our country is very divided politically. So how do you think love can be used as a tool to kind of understand one another and to reach common ground?
In some ways, I think it starts with love for oneself. It's which is not grandiose, or egotistical, but it's this rock bottom belief that if everybody wants to be happy, which would be a Buddhist, perspective, we have to know what happiness is, and that would be something about belonging and feeling at home, and that we get confused by ignorance and all the myths and lies we're told about where happiness is to be found. But it's almost like our wanting to be happy is rightful, and so then we can stand up and we can stand together. And understanding that, again, it's like bringing in compassion, as a kind of sister quality. That compassion can be very fierce and very intense, and that if we recognize that someone is acting wrongly, because of pain somewhere in them, or it's a very small little definition of life and its meaning, and that can elicit some compassion, which is going to be strong. And I think we can have that for one another, but we're not really meeting one another. We're not really coming together. We're not necessarily really listening. And we're not honoring the strength that can be there, even if we care.
Yeah, for me, I always think of love as a gift that's been given to me. Like it's something that I am in, but it's bigger than me, and I receive it. And it is that which interconnects me with everything that exists. People, animals, the world, everything, history, the past, the future, it's all in that space of love. And if you really believe that we are here, our ultimate, I love this term, our ultimate destiny, right? Our ultimate purpose is love. That has a radical equalizing effect, because it means if love is true like that, then you can't look at people and stack them up in terms of different levels of lovability. I mean, it's a really radically justice-orienting impulse in us. And if we truly, I mean, this is what Baldwin's trying to say, if we truly loved each other, then the injustices around us would be intolerable to us. Like we simply couldn't wake up in the morning and go out and live in the world if we actually loved at the level that we are called to love, because the world is constructed in injustice. And so I think it's like that force, and that's what like makes it spiritual, because you can't, when something comes from that place in you, you can't stop it. And that force for social change is like a train. I mean, that is going somewhere. It can't be stopped because it's so grounded and so true. And, you know, the process of changing the world is not just going to come from the ideas in our heads. It's going to come from the changes in our bodies and our hearts that just propel us forward to make it better in an kind of unstoppable way.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that.
You okay with that?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I feel like almost every religion that I can think of, there's at least one spiritual teaching that kind of relates to that, you know, that you have to love one another as you love yourself, or something to that effect. Yeah, I feel like so many political issues within our country could just be solved by putting in more effort to try and love and understand one another. And that's something that, as an activist, I've had to work really hard to try and do. So like something that I've, like when I was getting trained to be an escort for like an abortion clinic in Kentucky, they taught us not to interact with the people who were protesting, but one thing that they did say, if you ever got upset, is to kind of try and see things from the perspective of the people who were protesting, even if you don't necessarily agree, but to just kind of understand that from their perspective or the way that they understand the issue, it seems like the thing that is most moral or most right to do. And you can be mad for the way in which they're handling it, but it can help you to better understand the situation, to better handle the situation, if you can at least understand that they feel like they're doing the loving thing. And you can handle that situation differently, and you can prevent them in different ways politically, but in that specific situation, it's best to just try and understand the other person's point of view as best you can, rather than letting yourself just get mad because they don't agree with the issue in the same way that you do.
And I think that raises this really interesting question of what role does anger play in the connection in lives that are spiritually activist grounded. Because like there's one part of me that wants to say, well, if I really love, then I wouldn't have any anger, because I would be able to see, you know, have compassion, deep compassion, and my anger would leave. But then I just get so mad. And some of that's healthy, because it's just some of the things, the injustices are, I mean, they're tragic and immediate and require a lot of us. And yet then there's that tipping point where you see your anger is eating you up and disabling you with respect to your capacity to act in the world. And just that, like, anger and activism is, I see at Union Theological Seminary, we have to work with students all the time on, you know, is your activism coming out of a grounding in love that allows your anger to always, you know, have that base, or if it's just pure anger, not only are you going to become an intolerable person, but you're going to burn out. Like, you're not going to make it very long if that's the main thing fueling you. But you can't get rid of your anger. I mean, because anger is also important. Yeah, I'd love to hear what you say about that, because...
Yeah, I mean, that's the chapter I'm on right now.
Okay, all right. Help us.
Totally
Help
absorbing.
us. Yeah.
I'll go back to the Buddhist psychology for a moment, where he likened anger to being like a forest fire which burns up its own support. And that's not a question of feeling anger, it's a question of being consumed by anger. Because we feel what we feel, and we need to honor what we feel. And certainly with something like anger, there's a very positive part, which is energy. And there's also a sense of integrity often, and courage. Like, sometimes it's the angriest person in the room who's the only one willing to say, oh, look at that flaw. There's no flaw in the rug. The rug is perfect, but let's just pretend, look at that, and everyone else is looking the other way and trying to pretend and being nice. And they're the ones saying, look at that. And so we need to grapple with that positive part, but it is devastating, often, and it is consuming if we get lost in it, if we really identify with it, and people become bitter. And I hear, in a lot of activist organizations, one of my great activist friends once told me, she needed the outrage in order to wake up and move forward and really take a stand about things, but she didn't know how to dial it down. And so everyone in the organization was like on each other and backbiting, and so at the same time we can honor the energy, we have to see that destructive nature if we're lost in it. And so what do people do to get perspective? I've talked to people who recall sitting at people's deathbeds, that in the end, this is also what happens. And what happens if we work and put all our energy into something and also remember that this life just goes. And certainly love as a force, having one another, having that sense of community, and also having a sense of joy. Back to the civil rights movement, when I was reading Bernice Johnson Reagan from Sweet Honey in the Rock, and she'd say, we didn't march sobbing, we marched singing. And there's a reason for that, because if you're sobbing, you're devastated, and you just can't go on after a certain point.
Yeah, I think that kind of ties into, I was reading a collection of Audre Lorde's essays, and I know she said something to the effect of anger is something that can be used as a tool for social change. And I feel like what you were talking about, using your pain and using your anger as a tool to make a difference, because sometimes the person experiencing the most pain or the most anger is the only person who can actually point out that something is going wrong. But I think it's using that emotion, but also tying it in with love is what can kind of create the change that is necessary, because anger in and of itself is not always productive, because it's good at identifying problems, but it's not always good at solving them. But love, I think, is the thing that can motivate you to actually change things. And I feel like a good example of that would be, for example, Ferguson. I think you see a lot of anger and pain at why are Black people being shot and killed in the street. But I think it's also the love that they, Black people and just the people within that city had for not only one another, but also for this country, that motivated them to actually make a difference. Because you can be mad about something, but when you really love the community that you're in, and you love the people that you're protecting, you're actually motivated to figure out, okay, what can we do next to keep this from happening? So it's kind of a blend of those different emotions.
Another interesting thing that I've noticed, and this has happened to me as I've aged, but I've sort of, I'm turning 60 this summer, and it started happening to me in my 40s, more in my 50s, and I also had a bout with cancer and almost died, and I've gotten to this point where I love my life, and I love being alive, but being able to let go of my life and like to be not afraid of dying has freed my activism in ways that I don't have to prove myself in my activism, but I also don't have to protect myself. And I think our desire to protect ourselves, sometimes that protection can take the form of being the perfect activist, you know, and that can that can freeze people in their tracks because they think, oh my God, I don't know how to be the perfect activist, so I can't be an activist at all, or I'm going to mess it up, or I'm going to be politically incorrect, and then they get frozen. And I think there's something sort of freeing about letting go of your life and giving it over to the movement. And you're way beyond where I was at your age, but I wouldn't have in my 20s been able to do that. My life was dependent on the movement. You know, that was where my life was becoming, rather than the giving of my life to it. It's very freeing. And that's why I think the change that is happening is, since we are aging as a population, that we're going to see a lot more activism, not just from young people, but from older people. You know, people who have retired or who have reached that point in their life where they're ready to say, okay, I'm going to give it my all because I'm going to be out of here pretty soon anyway, so here I am. And that's very exciting to me. And I'm looking at the time and I'm wondering if I didn't want to stop you two from saying something else, but I wonder if it's time we get all of you into the discussion.
What a lovely invitation, Serene. Thank you so much, and I'll help you to do that. So those of you who have just joined us on Facebook Live, we're talking about real change, how spirituality can power activism. And the Rubin tries to open a window on our inner world so we can better navigate our outer one. And you have given us so many guiding points in that navigation tonight. So thank you, the three of you are really, really helpful. So before we take the first question, who would actually like to ask a question? Great, we'll get a mic to you and also in the back row. But I just want to point out one thing that I thought was particularly pertinent and relates to what we have upstairs, because the words of fear and anger have both emerged in the last 9 minutes in this conversation. And we recently were given a portrait of a Tibetan female deity called Green Tara. Some of you might be familiar with her presence. And her role, her function, her projection is as the protectress against the 8 fears. And so one of those fears of the 8 is the fear of being consumed by flames of fire. And each of those, whether they're being fear of being trampled by wild elephants or being mauled by wild lions, or whatever those sort of symbols are in the painting, they actually represent a psychological state. And fire represents anger. And you can now understand what this conversation was tilting towards, that anger is great, but it can get out of control just like fire can. It can consume you. And you'll be inhibited as a result. And so, Lydia, you absolutely use the right expression in terms of anger as a tool. And in Tibetan Buddhism, absolutely, particularly in Tantric Buddhism, using all these emotional avenues as tools for fierce love. This fierce awareness of how we should have a radial understanding of how things connect. That's actually what this function of this art is. So we are open till 9, so after this conversation, your ticket gets you there. So do go to the 3rd floor, say hello to Green Tara, she'll say hello back. Yes, sir, you had a question.
Yeah. Oh. I don't think this is on.
Do use the microphone because we are live streaming, so we'll need to hear.
Is it on? Do we think it's
yes,
on?
It is.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I just had one of you briefly mentioned reading an online source, something called On Being, but I would be curious to hear from each of you briefly what information source that's not essays, that's not books, but is kind of more newsy and topical, that satisfies your need to, or desire to kind of stay on top of the fusion of spiritual and the political, and that kind of sustains your general interest? Yeah,
I read her.
I read her.
There isn't one really, is there?
Yeah. Pardon?
Is it, you didn't? Nothing immediately came to mind, right?
Well, no, I was actually thinking about being at a school that's activist school. I almost feel overwhelmed with the information about the active. I mean, we are so involved all of the time, and I think that being actively involved in some space of struggle is the best way to connect to the energy and think about what's happening. And then the sources of how you can be empowered in that context become more apparent. But that's always been for me. Last night at Union, Michelle Alexander, who wrote the book The New Jim Crow, interviewed Michael Bennett, who is a NFL football player, just traded from the Eagles to the Patriots. Amazing guy. He's been with Colin Kaepernick, probably even more than Colin Kaepernick, doing the protest anthem. And he has no real formal education in anything political or anything spiritual, but the authenticity with which he spoke about human dignity and why, if you have a platform, you can't stand up straight if you're not bringing in the voices of those who have no voices. It was like, and I'm not going to read that anywhere, but that sort of wisdom that you just get from connecting to people who are doing this work and the complexity of their lives. That was a long answer, but if you don't read Sharon, or you can read Sharon and do that.
Wow.
Are you going to respond to that, Sharon, as well, or should we move on? No,
Why don't you move on?
Okay.
If something comes,
Thank you
I'll
so
go
much.
on
Yes.
back to it.
Hello at the back.
Hi. So your story about leaving the church that you grew up in because of your identity as a queer woman of color resonated so deep with me, and it's something that I experienced growing up as well. And I noticed that a lot of people leave places of worship and social justice institutions, not because of disillusionment with like the core ideology, but because of how it's operationalized. And either way, it's a spiritual wound, and it often leaves huge vacuums in people's lives. And so my question is, do you have any advice or guidance for people who keep coming back to institutions and places of worship, but continue to find themselves kind of leaving those places that they think might be, like this time it might be better, and this time they might have room for me, but continue to be kind of hurt by and harmed by these institutions, but want to believe that we could be better?
That's a great question. I think that's something that I'm still kind of navigating. So I am a student at NYU, and NYU is a very liberal, progressive school, but it's definitely not radical. And I'd say that our activist spaces definitely, as much as they try to advocate for students who are lower income or have been previously incarcerated or people of color and things like that, a lot of the students within that activist space kind of are in denial about the privilege that they may hold, especially when it comes to class. And so for students who are passionate about activism, many of whom are lower income or are previously incarcerated or are people of color, it can be kind of difficult because they don't really feel like they fit in, because those students who are privileged because of class and things like that, they're kind of in denial of the privilege that they have, and they can be kind of insensitive. So the advice that I'd give for you is, before entering those spaces, I would kind of try and this is just what I've done, to try and kind of just interact with the people who you know are a part of that activist scene. So I know my freshman year when I first came to NYU, what I did before I really got into like Students for Justice for Palestine or the Black Student Union is I kind of talked with the students who I could tell were kind of leaders of that organization. And I just got an idea of what their identity, what their background was like, and the kinds of things that they liked to do. Because I know that there were some activist organizations at NYU where the leaders, they seemed to have the right familiarity with the theory of what it is they were trying to achieve, but their praxis was just not very good. And they weren't aware of the ways in which they were benefiting or privileged, and it showed. And it affected their actual activism. It was harmful to the people who were actually trying to do the work, because some people were doing it because they just wanted to feel like they were doing the right thing. They kind of had a savior complex. And some people were doing it because it directly affected them and the people that they cared about. So I think just getting to know the people within the activist scene before you take on that labor for yourself is really important. And just because you or someone that you know is directly affected by that activism, don't feel like you always have to be the one doing the work. Let them do the work, and if the community that they're creating seems like something you want to take part in, then join it. But don't be afraid to just step back and watch.
We've got another question right next door. Yes?
Yes, thank you. I was really struck by many things you said, but by the powerful way that you talked about love, both love and anger as a source of this work. And I work very closely with a movement of people who are kind of in spiritual crisis, but are very secular and don't have good spiritual language. I work with people who sort of built online tools that have now become a source of a lot of hate speech and a lot of problems, and they are feeling deep crisis about that history and are trying to change it, but many of them don't have deep spiritual language to talk about it. And I was wondering if you had advice for helping to bring spiritual language to secular movements where spirituality is needed.
That's also a great question. So, as I said in my introduction, I'm agnostic. So something that I kind of started was not being afraid to, I think a lot of things start with just yourself. And something that I did, like I've written essays and blog posts for the Freedom from Religion Foundation and things like that. And in doing that, I never really shame religion. I think that religion and spirituality have a place in helping us to understand things and explain and expound on things that we can't necessarily discuss in the physical context. And I think kind of underscoring that when you're talking to people within a secular situation can kind of be helpful, because there are things like when we talk about love and we talk about anger, yes, we can understand that in a physical sense, in a scientific sense, but it's also much deeper. And kind of the conversation that we were having, love is such a powerful emotion. I think that's a great way to just start and to kind of get people to start thinking about the spiritual and how it can affect us. And also tying it in, like the example that I was giving about how, for me, activism is in and of itself a spiritual act for me, helping people to kind of figure out what is the spiritual thing that you do that maybe you didn't even realize was spiritual for you. So whether that's volunteering, whether it's activism or teaching people things, helping people to understand how that may manifest in their life can be really helpful. Because not everyone meditates, not everyone prays, but I think humans are in and of themselves spiritual beings in some sort of way, whether or not they realize it. And so it's kind of helping people to figure out what it is that they do that's spiritual, and that can kind of help them to find that language for themselves.
And sometimes I think, there are different parts of that process. One is a personal process, like for you, if you're in some way guiding this, is how would you relanguage all these things, words about awareness and intention and community and being a team, rather than a solitary player. And what about aloneness, and where do we think strength lies? And and part of it is a collective effort, which is kind of interesting and often fun in its own way, of redeeming words. It's like I said love here. I might not say love in every situation. I was teaching here this afternoon, and I said, once I wrote a book, and the editor said to me, well, I used the term loving kindness in our editorial meeting, and everyone started laughing. So couldn't you just say compassion? And I thought, okay, let's look at that, and is there a difference? And, there are ways in which so many of these words have gotten into a certain silo, or they're used as weapons, or but what if we look at love or things like that as a group, as a community? And it's very interesting and very powerful to do that.
And I also think that there's a very strong way in our society in which we've lost track of ourselves. And I find that just talking to people about what they think the meaning of their life is. Like, it's a really simple question, but why do you think what's the purpose of your life? And that often is tied to asking people, okay, so if you were to die next week, what would you want people to remember about who you were? Just to sort of like ask those kinds of questions that bring you right down to the ground of thinking about what it's all about. And getting people to think about death, which is inevitable, but it's always a place to kind of say, what does it mean?
These have been great questions, so keep them coming. We've got time for about a few more. Yes, we've got two on that side of the house. Thank you. Whoever wants to go first.
Hi. You touched on this a little bit, but I wonder if you could speak a little bit further about burnout in terms of activism. Like even Sharon, when you were talking about voting, I keep thinking that like I'm vacillating between trying to stay informed and trying to stick my head in the sand, because like even leading up to the primaries, I just can't handle it all. So if you could talk each about your experiences with burnout and managing burnout.
Well, I mean, I think that kind of discretion and balance is a great thing, and I personally get all my news from Twitter, to be honest, which I'm on all the time. But I haven't watched cable news since before the presidential election, and which was a big change for me. And I have friends who yell at me about that, and I just say, I don't need to know every detail, because it just gets me upset and all riled up, and it saps my energy to sort of be committed to the things I'm committed to, and I am committed to those things, and there's a certain allowing of joy, which I think is also important in that balance. I was writing this story about a friend of mine who years and years ago, probably 30 years ago or more, he was probably at that time, he was the most activist kind of person I knew. And he was also massively depressed. And friends were spending time with him in different ways. And he said at one point, to me, spending time with him, he said, I can't even allow myself to enjoy a banana because I know the process of how many people have suffered in that getting into my hands. And I wouldn't say that was cause and effect, but it was close to that, that for him to go on and face that kind of suffering all the time and be committed to taking action in the face of that kind of suffering, he did need to allow some joy and enjoyment. I don't know if it had to be a banana, but something. Otherwise, it was just way too much. And there's so much guilt often, and
Yes.
In different communities and for different reasons. But I was teaching a workshop for the Parkland community in Florida, and somebody said to me, I feel really weird because this is such a tremendous experience, and I know the only reason I'm having it is because that terrible thing happened, and so many people suffered. So how do I get over that feeling and just get to enjoy it? And I said, I don't think you get over it, but you learn to open also to the joy, and that's been kind of a tremendous thing to watch. And a lot of that joy has come from a sense of community, of people working together in different ways. So we can be so self-punishing on top of everything else. that I think it's something to really pay attention to.
And I think sleep. It's such a simple word, but sleep is like, in my life, the biggest thing to stop burnout is to make sure I get enough sleep. And nothing comes in between me and my sleep.
Oh, good.
But it's like if you deplete yourself, you're not going to be able to do anything. I'm a
Thank you.
9-hour
We've got
person.
another question right there. Yes.
Me too.
Yeah, in the same vein, staying with somewhat of the same thought, the word that comes to my mind after I'm 73, a lifetime of activism, is impotence. I've been active. I've done a lot. So much gets undone. I understand Buddhist impermanence, but I'm stuck in impotence now. What? How do you not just not be burnt out, but feel like there's some power?
I can speak on that just a little bit. This is a very small example, but one example I can think of is my activism that I did in high school. So I started a Black student union at my high school, and it was really strong. My senior year of high school, we put together a Black Lives Matter protest around like downtown. We like marched around the city, and we had over 500 people show out. And that was probably like my crown jewel of like all that I had done with the Black Student Union. I was really proud of it. But after I graduated, it just kind of fell apart. And there were a lot of things that I wish our Black Student Union had taken more action with. So for example, our principal, my high school principal, was recorded on tape saying the N-word in reference to a student. And our Black Student Union did very little in response to that, which was very disappointing to me. And I think I just had to focus on the small victories of, even though who knows what effect the protests that I put together actually had, just focusing on the fact that it had happened. And then also the people that I know that I may have inspired to pursue maybe not a career in activism, but at least, a hobby of activism. Because there were people who reached out to me and were like, I never would have attended a protest if I hadn't seen the amount of effort that you had put into the BSU or had put into like the Feminist Society at our high school. And I think focusing on those things and the seeds that you've planted in other people just through your work can kind of give you a sense of maybe it was worth it, even if no one really picks up the slack of what it is that you did in the specific activism that you worked on. You may have inspired someone to do something that they wouldn't have done otherwise. And for me, that makes it worth it, even if all the things that I put together don't necessarily last forever.
Thank you. We have a question right here, and then we'll come to you. Yeah, thank you.
So along the lines of what you're saying about like each of us can do something that we are satisfied from or that we get something out of, I was thinking about metta practice, the thing that you've spent, Sharon, your life teaching. And in the years since I've been doing this practice, I think about metta practice as an activist practice.
Could you define metta for the people, since you're using the word?
It's loving kindness practice. It's a Buddhist meditation practice, a repetition of phrases, offering love to a benefactor, a friend, a neutral person, a difficult person, and all beings. And so you're repeating the phrases, or maybe if it's radiant metta, maybe you're just paying attention, focusing your attention on that feeling of offering love to all beings in some way. And so I would love to hear from you, because I feel that it's an activist practice in doing the practice. But you as the teacher, I'd love to hear from you like your thoughts on metta as an activist practice.
I mean, I certainly think that it's a radical practice, you know, and that it is an activist practice in many ways, and not least of which because of the consequence of how it affects us, you know. And so they say the Buddha taught that practice is the antidote to fear, and I think keeping that in mind makes it make a lot of sense. You know, many times people, especially these days, say, you know, that's crazy, and, you know, why would I do that? And that's just like giving in, or that's being sweet, you know, and meek, or something like that. And if that's how you view it, it makes no sense to be cultivating. But I keep coming back to, what if it's really the antidote to fear? And having that sense of connection allows us to move forward and do things or say things, or even just include those we might normally have excluded. That's a pretty radical thing, and it's like the platform from which we can do many things. The reason I hesitated was because I was telling Serene the story earlier when somebody had asked me online through Twitter to lead or offer a minute of meditation for the kids who were in cages at the border. And so I did that, and then I got a lot of feedback about that too. You know, like, you're as bad as the people just offering thoughts and prayers after gun violence in the school. You know, why aren't you doing something? This is really stupid. And it's very interesting. And this is what happens when you read the comments. And what I kept replying was things like, these things are hard to look at for me, and practices like loving kindness give me a different kind of sense of space, and that allows me to look at them directly and be there. Or I don't confuse the offering of loving kindness with taking action. But it's tiring, and sometimes it's frustrating, and it's very hard to see that anything's happening. But I know that happened. You know, that I cared, and that I was willing to open, and so on. So it's really the platform for, I think, a very different way of being.
And I think, thank you, Sharon, for that, and thank you for your question. I think a lot of us can start somewhere, even if we're not engaged on that practice, to set an intention to have an impact or do something, and so that you feel like you're being active. And so I encourage you, when you leave this room, make your way to the base of the spiral staircase, because we've got an installation called the Wheel of Intention, and it's modeled on a Tibetan prayer wheel. The idea that you would put a prayer inside a drum and spin that drum, and your kinetic energy generates, of course, an energy that sends out in a sort of centrifugal form this intention out into the world to have impact. And so this is, I'm afraid, a digital version, so you actually have to type it in. And you can also contribute or email if you like, but press return and then spin the rim of the wheel, and you will see the dynamo inside generates the energy to illuminate your intention in words on the underside of the spiral staircase. And if you keep on spinning that wheel, that intention will continue to spiral up and up until it reaches the 5th floor exhibition, the power of intention. And there's a room in which everybody's intentions, those who have been putting them into the wheel of intention, and those also, if you're online, you can do that as well. Just go to the power of intention page. All those are joined together, so you can actually see what is passing through people's minds and what is set out there in terms of energy. And of course, that affects you when you actually witness other people's proclaimed intentions. So our intention is to end on time. So we have, I know we've got a dedicated question in the room. Is there anybody else who is urgently requiring to ask a question and has never asked a question in public before? Well, still, you're the only one who had your hand up. So right in the back there, if we can, Eileen, thank you. Yes, hello.
Hi, thank you all so much. You've already given me a lot of feedback around mobilizing my anger and compassion and love. And I'm just curious because I think that one important movement that's going on right now that I didn't really hear touched on, but I'm sure is important to you in different ways, is animal welfare. And so I know that we talk a lot about human rights and what we can do in these different groups of suffering, but I think one of the silent communities that are suffering among the most are animals. And so there's a lot of power right now behind the vegan movement and around reducing animal agriculture and all of that. And so just curious if any of you are right now actively involved in what you would say to those like myself who are very passionate and get kind of lost and consumed in my anger sometimes around those who are not doing enough to reduce their meat intake and all of that. So just kind of what you as leaders in this community of activists would recommend.
I guess I'll start. So my freshman year of college and also my junior year of high school, I was vegetarian, and it was because of like the environment and also just like concern for animals. I'm currently not vegetarian, I do eat meat, but it is something that I try to be mindful of just because I do understand that I've watched a couple of documentaries just on like the meat industry and like how animals are treated. So I definitely think it's something that you should be mindful of. I've tried to educate my family and the people in my life as well, just about what happened. And so it's something that I tried to definitely be conscious of. And I've definitely cut down on how much meat I eat in comparison to how much I used to eat in the past. It's something I do a couple times a week rather than like multiple times a day. Like I said, I grew up in the South, so I ate meat probably every meal, and that's definitely not something that I do now. But like for health reasons and like other reasons, I don't think that right now, and also financial reasons, I don't think that right now going vegan or going vegetarian is something that would be particularly easy for me. But it's definitely something that I want to like work on.
I just think that a simple insight that has been important to me is getting people to realize that human beings are animals. It's not human beings and then animals. It's like we're all animals, and that just simple mind shift can be profound, have a profound impact on how we view, we have such a binarism there.
There's that greater connectivity, of course, that life is precious and it is interconnected. So anything we do has repercussions, and understanding the devastating nature of our habitual action without understanding the implications of what those actions mean is really our responsibility. That is the love that we can exercise and being more aware. So, yes, we have a last question. Hello.
Thank you. Sharon, I was inspired by your talking about your active use of Twitter. I just listened to an amazing podcast interviewing Jack Dorsey, who's one of the founders of Twitter, and he was talking about his experience of getting criticism around voicing his impressions when he was in Burma after a Vipassana retreat. And a lot of what he was talking about was their reaction at Twitter to what has transpired and how they're trying to redesign it towards conversational health. And I'm curious, as an active Twitter user and as an expert on metta meditation, do you have any thoughts about how that could move forward?
I think it's a tremendous thing, and it would be, I am a very active Twitter user. Even just saying the word, I think, where's my phone? It's like so far away. Even aside from the addictive qualities, wouldn't it be incredible if we had different agreements about how we were going to speak to one another in disagreement? Because we all get confused about views, or we have different influences, and it's kind of interesting to hear, maybe that's not the whole picture. or maybe there's another way of seeing it, but we don't have those kind of agreements. And so it would be like it would be a whole kind of intentional process to say, can I use this medium in a way that actually enhances compassion rather than denigrates it in some way? And certainly people are trying to explore that, which I think is really fascinating. What do we need? Because the other thing that fascinates me is what I keep reading about, an epidemic of loneliness, how tremendously lonely people are reporting themselves to be. And I'm very pro-technology, obviously, even though it can certainly be excessive and weird. But what if that were a way of building bridges, for people to not feel so completely isolated? But it's so kind of random now, and the vitriol is kind of startling. And I look forward to a brighter future, with that.
After I'm on Twitter all the time too, but I had this kind of radical shift the Easter morning when the article came out. I opened up Twitter and there was a picture of an ISIS beheading and saying, this is what I deserved. And it was sort of like something that had been connecting suddenly became not just irritating, but a weapon that was quite devastating. And so I think Twitter will only be as good as we are. I mean, in a sense, and it's going to show all of the parts of us in any form of communication that are there to be shown. So at that point, I wanted to shut down every Twitter account everywhere and just say never look at it again. But